Welcome, everybody. Good morning from the Midwest. I think most folks joining us today are in the Midwest somewhere, so I think it's morning for all of us still today. My name is Charity Counts. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Midwest Museums. I'm a white woman with fair skin and dark hair and eyes. I'm joining you today from my home office in Indiana, which has blue walls, white doors, and a painting of a woman with her head in her hand hanging on the wall. Today, I'm also wearing my favorite yellow jacket and a proud museum person t-shirt. Welcome to How One Training Program Moved Us from Talk to Action, a presentation by Sarah Henderson, Director of Outreach and Innovation at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. This is the first session in our series of virtual lightning talks. Today's talk is being recorded, and we'll share it with you on another day. We were going to be trying to stream, it's not working, to Facebook and YouTube, but that's okay. We're glad you could join us here today. I also want to be transparent about AMM's desire and commitment to making our programs more accessible and inclusive. Like I'm sure is true of many of you, we're doing this one step at a time. And on that note, today we are using Zoom's built-in live captioning feature, which has its imperfections, but we'll do our best to speak clearly to ensure that as much of Sarah's message can be delivered to as many people as possible today. Before we begin today's program, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we are gathered today virtually, each of us joins from the unceded land of Indigenous peoples. During virtual events like this, digital spaces may substitute our physical sense of place, and it's important to redirect our attention to the land we each occupy in this moment and honor the Indigenous peoples who have called it home. The office of AMM is in Indianapolis, Indiana, the homeland of the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Wee, and Kickapoo communities. I invite you to join me in acknowledging these and all other Midwestern Indigenous communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. AMM recognizes that our organization and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society, which caused the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout the Midwest and beyond. Thank you for helping us challenge these practices by disrupting and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, please join me in welcoming Sarah Henderson to the stage, so to speak. Feel free to cheer in the chat however you would like. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Henderson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Today, I am wearing a pink shirt with stripes, trying to feel very spring here. And I am at my office at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library with some white walls and an empty whiteboard, which should be some inspiration to make a to-do list, but I have not yet. Today, I'm super excited to be sharing a program with you that I started about 3 years ago. I started at this museum 3.5 years ago. And I'll go ahead and start sharing screen just so I don't forget. My grad school work was in accessibility in museums and lots of different ways that has been funded statistically and historically in the United States. And so when I started at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library, I knew I wanted to make changes and I wanted to make moves in my institution towards that direction. And I started an accessibility audit. I started drafting an accessibility plan. And some of those early conversations were really rough with staff. And I think that's just the nature of confronting people with uncomfortable truths. And I was also fresh out of grad school and still very combative, which is something that I have started working on and realizing that there are better ways to sort of make changes. People would get really defensive when we would have training sessions and conversations, and we didn't make a lot of headway. And the reason I want to underscore this program that I'm about to demonstrate or illustrate rather, is because this is when I really started to see a complete psychological shift within the museum. And it wasn't because of me and the words that I was saying, it was because of the people we were inviting to the table through this program. So without further ado, I will start describing the program, but I thought a really cool way, I'm a storyteller. So I thought a cool way to do that would be to tell you 3 stories of 3 individuals who participated in this program. So do I go next slide from, oh, here we go. So the first individual I want to highlight is Rob, and Rob was the pilot participant of this program. And this program, sort of colloquially, internally, we call the Accessible Training Program. And the way it started was not through some genius idea of a staff member or anything like that. It was simply saying yes to partnership options and opportunities. So Goodwill of the Heartland reached out to us about Rob's interest in our museum and his interest overall in exercising some of the skills that he gained in his undergraduate degree, which was a creative writing degree with a minor in film. And he had not been employed 5 years after graduation still. And that was extremely frustrating to him because he had very employable skills. But always realizing that there are more employable skills that he could gain, and also realizing that as a person with a disability, there were accommodations and technology requirements that would make him a more employable candidate. We started working with vocational rehab services. And sort of the description or distilled version of Voc Rehab, if you haven't worked with them in the past, is that they equip people with disabilities to prepare for a job, to get a job, and to retain a job. So we drafted a training program with Rob where he would receive payment from Voc Rehab Services, an hourly wage for the hours that he put at the museum. He would receive technological accommodations so that he could gain specific employability skills working with me. And then I would do these regular reports and check-ins with a Voc Rehab ambassador, with Rob, also him getting to advocate for what he felt he was learning or what he wasn't learning. And some examples of the accommodations that were provided were a brand new Mac laptop, software for different editing programs, a talk-to-text platform for when he would get fatigued typing, he could just start talk to text, which was also a really expensive software. And the reason I highlight these accommodations is because so far with this program, the only investment from the museum was myself, my time. We worked with Voc Rehab, they provided a wage, they provided accommodations. All I provided was a space and my time and mentorship. So it was a really easy first step to make when I had drafted this 10-page plan with really expensive accommodations and major program shifts and board changes and staff changes. This was a really important first, very small step for us to take that really only took my effort. But Rob was in every room that I was in through that training program. And so all of a sudden, a leader within the museum was bringing an individual who looked very different from everyone else in leadership positions at the museum to the table. And Rob was able to advocate from anything from program design to fundraising to marketing to education. He came on all my student visits with me, and my students got to know Rob and really bonded with Rob. And so one of the outcomes of his training program when he graduated and had met all the goals that we set with his job coach at Voc Rehab was that we had realized Rob and my advisory council of teens both had a shared passion for Dungeons and Dragons. Something was completely out of my world that I wasn't equipped to serve those teens with the knowledge and expertise to design a Dungeons and Dragons program, which was their ultimate dream for the museum. But Rob was equipped. He had a creative writing degree, he had a film background, and he was an experienced dungeon master himself. And so once Rob graduated from our training program, we started contracting him to write a full-on, over 100 pages Dungeons and Dragons manual based on Czech and Slovak mythology, utilizing castles, geography. So it's an incredibly educational experience for participants, but it's a really fun role-playing game. And that came from the minds of my teens and Rob while sitting in the same room together and talking about what they themselves wanted and what their peers probably would want from the museum. And we're still contracting Rob. One second, I'm just going to close this door. Someone stepped into the classroom. Sorry, guys. I love my office being next to a classroom, but that happens all the time. And Rob is still a contract employee with us. This summer, we're publishing his manual. You'll be able to purchase it in the store, and people will be able to play it for free if they participate in our in-person or virtual, maybe, we haven't decided yet, campaigns here at the museum. So next, I want to talk about Aries. Aries is a really good segue because Aries actually was on the Youth Advisory Council that I just talked about. And Aries also was a DM, Dungeon Master, and started a Dungeons and Dragons club at his high school, which is our local at-risk high school here in Cedar Rapids. So I've already talked about Voc Rehab Services, and I've talked about Goodwill of the Heartland, two great nonprofits that advocate and do workforce development training and provide resources. This program that I want to talk about is TAP, the Transitional Alliance Program, which exists here in Iowa in schools to help transition folks with disabilities into adulthood. So they get to continue to provide services to their graduated students after they graduate. So we started working with Aries. That's myself and our facilities director. And then the older guy in this photo is actually Aries' job coach. So Aries started working with us. I created an individualized training program, just like I did with Rob, except instead of getting payment from Voc Rehab, Aries was getting school credit through TAP. And his job coach would come with him to the site every day, and no matter what we were doing. So his job coach, Kurt, would build a picnic table if that's what Grant and Aries were going to be doing that day. So Grant, as our facilities director, ended up being the person that Aries bonded with the most and who he wanted to spend most of his time with in his training program. So the training program constantly is flexible and it's evolving to the needs of the individual who's trying to gain employment skills. And the really exciting success story out of this is not only that Aries through this program was invited to participate in the Teen Advisory Council and serve in a leadership position within our museum and within the community, but that when he graduated from high school and thus graduated from our training program, he decided that through his experience at the museum, he wanted to go into facilities management. And so he joined a facilities management apprenticeship program in Ottumwa. And to my knowledge, he's still there gaining, they do like a certificate-based sort of step-by-step. So you take one class and a certificate, you graduate, you get the next certificate. So that's a really cool example of someone participating in this program, building a really close relationship with someone on staff. And so I love this example because it's a great way to demonstrate buy-in. I had some of those really difficult confrontational conversations at the beginning of our accessibility transition plan. But it wasn't until moments like this is us at Aries' graduation party at his high school, where I realized there was nothing I could really do other than invite people to the table that was going to get staff to truly appreciate the need for accessibility and the need for investment from us. So that's a really great narrative to demonstrate how just bringing people to the table and into the room with your staff is going to help in more ways than you could ever do by yourself. And so then the final story, that's actually Aries. And then also in the picture is Caitlin. And they are right now in this photo building a temporary exhibit. So again, staff interaction. We're working with our facilities director, our curator, and our collections manager in this image. Caitlin was another participant who I got to know through Goodwill of the Heartland. And she was really interested in just something different. She had 2 part-time jobs. She was waking up at 3 in the morning to like deliver FedEx packages, and she was fatigued and she wanted something that she could get up and be excited to go to work to do. And so we started doing an individualized training program with her that first involved front of house skills because she thought she might be more interested in the service industry type of oriented position because she really liked her other part-time job at Hy-Vee. And so she shadowed our front desk, our store. She gave immigration house tours. We have a historical immigrant house. Lots of social skills were developed in that time. But again, flexibility was super important because as I got to know Caitlin more, I should have just called this talk like Dungeons and Dragons is the key to accessibility. But as I got to know Caitlin more, I found out that she also had a passion for Dungeons and Dragons. And so this was right around the time Rob and my advisory council, including Aries, were all talking about Dungeons and Dragons. And so Caitlin had a real interest in mythology and folklore. And so I asked her if she'd be willing to and interested in doing a complete literature review of Czech and Slovak folklore and mythology so that we could then categorize those characters and do sort of a survey of who pops up regularly in Czech mythology. Excuse me, and then we could pass that off to Rob, who would use it as the source material for his D&D manual. So it all was very full circle. She ended up doing that and passed it off to Rob, and now he's drafted the manual. And Caitlin is now graduated from this program, the accessible training program, and she's now been a for almost 2 years, probably, a part-time staff member in our event services department. I actually just got to see her yesterday for the first time since the pandemic because she was setting up for an event that we had this morning. So those are my 3 narratives. I'd love to answer questions now. I'm sure I've gone over a little bit. We've made a lot of other strides in regards to accessibility. When I was thinking about what to talk with this program, I almost thought we could cover this $50,000 grant that we got, and we're making major facilities accommodations and programmatic accommodations. But I wanted to start with something that seemed very tangible and you could do it tomorrow. You could reach out to Voc Rehab or Goodwill of the Heartland or the TAP equivalent program at a local high school, and you could set up a meeting tomorrow with those folks and find a way to start advocating and helping individuals interested in our sector. Because our sector is incredibly, our sector struggles incredibly with diversity. And so as an educator, I saw this as a perfect first step to make in a long-term effort to get people with disabilities employability skills in museums so that hopefully in the future, we'd have a wider application pool of folks who could get employed in museums. So yeah, ready for questions now.
Thank you, Sarah. I do see some questions coming in the chat, and we can do that. We'll address those here in a moment. Do you mind stopping the shared screen? So that, there we go. Awesome. So we'll take questions via the chat for anybody who has them. I see a couple have come through, and I know I've got questions too for you. We'll start with one from Maureen. It says, can you talk a bit more about staff resistance and how to overcome that?
Yeah, so I kind of talked in the beginning about how I was a little combative and accusatory in the beginning because I was fresh out of school, and that was just kind of like the academic dialogue. We were all talking like in theory, so we'd get in these heated conversations, and I brought that energy with me to the workplace where I was talking with folks who had been working at the museum longer than I had been alive. So perspective, and now being here for 3 years, has taught me that accusation is never the way that I think you want to start a conversation. And that was a lesson that I had to learn. The specific instance I'm remembering is that I was providing a staff training about language, like really specifically language, and let's change the language that we're using. And here's the history of the language you're using and why it's hurtful and why it's problematic. And I think people just felt called out. And I think they felt really hurt that this like new girl in town was coming in and just telling them they'd been doing everything wrong all along. And so I think if I could go back, I probably still would have done that training. I probably wouldn't have done it as academically as I did. And then instead of correcting people's language, I really learned that leading by example and making people just aware that you're using different language right after they just used that language is an easier way to help people change. And I'm using that example. There are lots of other examples. But the staff resistance totally changed when I brought people with disabilities into the room. And I chalk that up to like good old fashioned empathy building. I mean, so many of the older folks that I was working with then probably had never interacted with someone with a disability, never talked with them regularly, never had a staff meeting with them, definitely. And so that change obviously was monumental for them. And then myself, it was a way to demonstrate need better than I ever could have as an individual. And a really specific example is our library doors were not accessible. They didn't have any automatic open. They were just these glass doors that you had to pull open. And I wanted Rob originally to work in our library because he was doing a lot of writing. I wanted him to have a private space. And it wasn't possible because I refused to have him have to ask every time he needed to enter or exit the library for help. So instead, he worked in my office where the doors could be propped open and he could come and go as he pleased. I had been advocating for a while that the library doors weren't accessible. We have a lot of older folks who use our space too. It becomes a burden for them to have to open the door while using a cane or, whatever it is. But it wasn't until staff started witnessing Rob being unable to use that major public space in our building that I had staff buy-in that accommodation was necessary. And I can now proudly say that those doors not only have like an accessible button that you push, but it's motion censored, because that was also something that we realized. Rob couldn't come up our elevators by himself because it was a push button that he couldn't reach because of his limited mobility from his arms. And so that's something my staff would have never realized. It's something I probably would have never realized, but because we had Rob regularly using our space, and he would have to ask the front desk to push the elevator button for him, we realized like that needed to change, and it needed to change immediately. So when we got that $50,000 grant for accessibility accommodations, the first thing that we changed was that our buttons all went to motion censored instead of push buttons.
Wow. Well, and I know that you also mentioned in your talk just a major step in helping to create empathy around the needs, was bringing the people to the table, right? Who could really share their experience through just work. And was there any resistance to that, or any kind of adjustment, from a team perspective and the staff when Rob and the others from the VOC program started working with you?
No, I think there was a little bit with our front of house staff. They got really drained, I think, by constantly having to be on, because the front desk, you have to be on when there's a visitor. But when that visitor steps away, you can kind of relax, you can be more yourself. But because they were training specifically front of house skills and service industry, I think they would get fatigued after like 8 hours of just being on the whole time and like training an individual. But that was never something that was expressed to me or like resistance. It was just something that I kind of sensed that like it is kind of tiring to be teaching basically for 8 hours straight, which I understand as an educator. And that's part of why we realized we had to individualize and be flexible with that program. I mean, who wants to be trained in the front desk for 8 hours either? And so then that's when we kind of transitioned to, well, Caitlin has this passion for folk and mythology. So let's get her to do something with that as well. And then I guess as far as like bringing folks into the room, into meetings, I don't think there was ever really a discussion about it. I just one day said, I'm starting this program, and Rob's doing a job shadow and he'll be joining me in all my meetings. And I did the same thing with students too. I had the advisory council and I invited them to presentations and to meetings. I was working with high school students from that at-risk high school I mentioned, and they would come in and give presentations. They would be at staff meetings too. So it kind of just became a regular outcome from my department. Which is a culture change, but I didn't see or hear maybe there was resistance, but I didn't hear about it, which I guess then it doesn't really matter because people got used to it over time.
Well, and I think that just what you just said kind of relates to another question that had come through the chat. And I don't know that you've really specifically addressed this, although you've talked about your overall approach. So it sounds like nobody's really vocalized any kind of resistance to the change or anything, or they haven't been defensive or unwilling, or if they have, how have you addressed that? How do you handle those situations?
I think I said earlier that I'm a storyteller. When I started the talk. And so I use stories, and that's part of my background as an educator. If I'm trying to drill home a point about World War II, I'm going to use a story. I'm not going to use dates and facts. So I do remember a very specific instance where I was talking about an exhibit we had that I didn't think was accessible enough to people with visual disabilities. And one of our staff members had a really calloused response to that. And instead of saying that was really problematic, that was really calloused, I said, I had a young girl come to me the other day after going through our exhibit, and she was extremely disappointed and extremely sad that she didn't get to experience the exhibit at all. Like, they came to the museum to see that exhibit, and there was no sound in the gallery. There was nothing tangible for her to feel. So she had zero experience of this really cool exhibit, and I complimented the exhibit again. And I think that nailed it home, that it wasn't just me sitting in my office, from an ivory tower saying like, you're doing a bad job. It was, no, I interacted with someone who's really hurt, and I just want us to help them. And so I've always had much better success using a narrative or a story like that rather than a should or should not kind of perspective.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I've got another question that came in through the Q&A. As you've coached Rob, Caitlin, and Aries, what did you find that was most helpful, and what did you learn in the process?
each of them, I'm latching onto the helpful aspect because the really interesting thing about the training program is that it's brought so much more to the museum than I feel like I've given any of them. Like this whole Dungeons and Dragons thing, which when I started putting this talk together, I didn't even realize was going to be such a thoroughfare, but it is. Museums have such a hard time reaching teens. And through working with these 3 young individuals, we designed, wrote, and are publishing a major role-playing game that is going to, I have a feeling, reach a lot of young audiences. And we did that test play that was really successful. And people are really interested in this sort of programming. And I can't find any other museum right now that has scripted their own Dungeons and Dragons based on their museum content in an educational way. I would have never, ever in my wildest dreams come up with that kind of program, because I wouldn't have been like listening to people in my classroom advocating for the fact that that would be really fun and they'd want to do that. So as far as what was helpful, they brought so many resources, so many perspectives, and so many assets to the museum that I can never even begin to comprehend probably how much it's helped the museum. But as far as I think what that question was asking more so was like, what was helpful in that process, and how do I make sure like I'm serving them as mentees and a mentor? And I would say my educational practice is really informal, and it's very much based around relationship building. That's how I operate with my at-risk teen population that I work with, my advisory council, even my interns. I create a very informal space. I'm like sitting across from cabinets right now that are full of Gatorade and candy and like prizes that I've like pilfered from the store. I mean, I paid for them, but like I took them from the store here at the museum. And so I go into every mentorship experience and relationship, first and foremost, thinking to myself, and this is just sort of naturally like who I am, but I think it is really good practice to mimic. I go into it as just, I want to be this person's friend. I want to build a relationship with them. I want to have a long-term like life connection with them, which that sounds really weird, but like Rob and I are friends. I can like email Rob a funny story about my fiance. I like saw Caitlin yesterday and like lit up at seeing her for the first time since the pandemic started. I like cried at Aries graduation. Like each of these relationships for me were not necessarily about a formal training program. They were formal because I had to fill out paperwork because I'm working with Vogue Rehab and I'm working with TAP. But those were all very secondary to me. The first and most foremost thing is that I wanted them to feel comfortable in this space. And the first thing that I could do was be their friend. And I think that's like the most important thing that you could do as an educator to make people feel welcome in a space.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Related to that, was this program, or is this program different from, say, an internship?
Yeah, that's a great question because they sound very similar. Like in theory, internship programs are supposed to have these like goals and checkpoints and learning opportunities. And a lot of museum internships are unpaid, which is like an incredible struggle and a really big equity issue. And with the training program, the reason I'm advocating for it is because you don't immediately have to put a big financial investment into it, but that might mean an unpaid sort of experience, which is never the goal. It's never what we're going for. And so that's why I advocate, and I think it's necessary if you're going to do a program like this to find your community partners and allies in supporting people with disabilities. Rob was paid, and through that original year sort of introductory period of staff getting to know him and seeing his resources and assets and what he brought to the table, I was then able to convince my leadership that, yeah, no, this is a guy we need to pay and to contract for his services. I probably wouldn't have been able to do that with an intern doing an unpaid experience and then, you know, transitioning, because it was such a formal experience. It had the backing of Vogue Rehab Services, and they were able to provide all these sort of accommodations that were necessary for some of those skill sets to be developed. Aries received school credit towards graduation through the TAP program, or I guess that's redundant, the Transitional Alliance program. And Caitlin, unfortunately, was unpaid, but I was able to transition her pretty quickly to a part-time staff member position. So I think the difference largely comes from those partnerships. Those partnerships have to be a part of a program like this, because the other aspect that I fully recognize is I'm not a workforce development professional. I'm an educator. I'm passionate about mentorship and accessibility and diversity. But the folks that I'm working with, it is their full-time job to help place people with disabilities into successful employment matches. That's not my full-time job. And so having someone at the table who is really equipped and knowledgeable about that industry and the services that are available and the resources is absolutely a necessity in a program like this. And that's what's absent from an internship program. And I think it's also really important that you have those partners at the table to make sure that you're not just creating another abusive, industry for unpaid labor, specifically since you're working with a vulnerable population already.
Great. Well, I think we're close to time here, so I'm going to take one more question from the Q&A. And I think it's a really nice question to sort of wrap up the conversation. This is obviously something you feel passionately about. Would you share a story about how accessibility became such a focus for you?
It's so interesting. I haven't ever thought about the origin, actually, of where that came from for me. Personally, like on an emotional level, as an individual, I came from a rural community. And this isn't like accessibility related to disability. This is just accessibility in general within museums and sort of this psychological like barrier that exists for a lot of folks as to why they aren't welcome at a museum. So coming from a rural community and having the family background that I had, I was first gen. I grew up in a single mother household. I was partially raised by my grandparents. I didn't feel like a museum was an art museum or like a higher, education sort of area or environment was where I belonged. I felt that way even when I went to undergraduate, felt like a fish out of water. I felt that way definitely in grad school in DC in a museum studies program with a lot of kids who grew up surrounded by arts and culture. And so accessibility, I think, has always been on my mind in the sense of like, I want all people to feel like they belong in a museum and they belong in those spaces of arts and culture. I remember the first time I saw a play, I sobbed because I had never seen a professional play before. And so it was really overwhelming to experience that for the first time, but that was probably because for 20 years of my life, I didn't feel like I belonged in those spaces. But then in relation to disability, I had a mentor at the National Endowment of the Arts who was the director of accessibility there. And she spoke one time to my class in grad school, and I went up to her afterwards. And I was like, I think I really need to learn more about this. This just really struck a chord with me. And she said, let's do lunch. And then at that lunch, she offered me an internship. And so I did an internship at the NEA for a semester. And it completely changed my worldview, my perspectives, and my concepts of what a museum or an arts and culture nonprofit could do for people with disabilities. She turned me on to so many different programs. We did like a complete national survey of funders in the accessibility world, which turned me on to all these different programs. So I would say in relation to disability, it was a mentor, which is so fitting with this conversation because we're talking all about mentorship and bringing people with different perspectives into the field. I probably would have never been turned on to this if it weren't for a mentor.
Yeah, it's something that I feel like a lot of us reflect on regularly, how important mentorship is, especially in our profession. Well, thank you, Sarah, for your wonderful talk today and for your candor during the question and answer, and for inviting us behind the scenes into your process at the museum and understanding your efforts to become more accessible there. I think you're all doing wonderful work. And I know, like I said earlier, it's one step at a time for many of us, and whatever helps to move the chain, I guess. Thank you all for being with us today. We appreciate all of your questions and the comments, and we'll be happy to follow up with you with the recording from today's session. It's free to all, so you're welcome to share it with your colleagues if it helps to start conversations internally at your museums. I would also like to invite all of you to join us next month on June 10th at 10 a.m. Central, 11 Eastern for our next lightning talk featuring Carolyn Maslumi. She's a world-renowned quilt artist and curator and founder of the Women of Color Quilters Network. She'll be talking about an exhibition she organized following the murder of George Floyd last year, and how museums and their exhibitions can inspire dialogue and change hearts and minds. So hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks again, and have a great day and weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If anyone wants to have a conversation, my email's on the Czech Museum website. Just look me up, send me an email. I'd love to have a phone call.
Thanks, Sarah. Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.